Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. David Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. David is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Hello, David.
How are you doing?
I'm
good. To see you.
Good to see you. Really excited. We just finished the intensive in South San Francisco, and it was fantastic.
It was our highest rated intensive in 25 years, and it was like magic or like a series of miracles. And part of it was people just opened their hearts, and so there was a lot of crying, a lot of laughter, a lot of healing occurred. The live demonstration on the night of day one that I did with Jill Levitt was just, it was like a miracle. It was just
mind-blowing.
Just mind-blowing, and there was tremendous personal healing throughout the workshop. And so if you didn't get a chance to go to Calgary or to South San Francisco in November, I'm going to have another intensive in Atlanta, Georgia. It's my first East Coast intensive in more than 25 years. And I can't promise it'll be as good as these others, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a great one too. And then I've also got, in October 3rd, I think, if you go to my website, to the workshop page, I've got a 5 Secrets workshop coming up, a one-day with Jill Levitt, and you can join that one from anywhere in the world online or come in person. So today we're going to have, on podcast 153, we're going to do some great Ask David questions. Thank you, all of you, for writing and asking questions and submitting your ideas for podcasts. We also have an important announcement before we dive into the Ask David.
Thank you, David. I just want to say that we don't know when exactly this episode will be published, but we want to add our voices to the many who have expressed their sympathies to the families and friends of the victims of the recent gun violence in Gilroy, California, El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. We feel tremendous sadness, grief, shock, and anger, and we hope the survivors' physical and emotional recovery is swift and complete.
And one last point is that while many of the mass shootings have been sadly the result of mental illness, people with paranoid schizophrenia or people in psychotic, possibly manic episodes, most of the mass shootings are not the result of mental illness, but hatred. The mass shooting in El Paso was because of hatred toward people from Mexico, people with brown skin, and also many of these are triggered by having access to these fantastic machine guns, really, to mow people down. And while the NRA states that there is not a causal link between gun ownership or the ownership of these guns capable of mass violence and these shootings, there is a causal link. It's just temptation. If you put these weapons in people's hands, many will be tempted to use them and are using them. And we think that this needs to be one of our highest national priorities to stop the violence, stop the sale of these machine guns, and stop spreading the language of hatred with labeling people, bad people, murderers, rapists, putting people down. It's terrifying, and it's outrageous.
Thank you.
So now
let's change let's change just a little, or a lot actually, because if you don't mind, I'd really love to read this beautiful email that someone sent about our episode number 151, which was on how team therapy works with LGBTQ within that community. And so do you mind if I start by reading this?
Yeah, that's a great way to get us off to a good start.
Dear Dr. Burns, once again I have to thank you. This time it's for podcast 151. I have been openly gay, prominently proud my entire life. No one would ever imagine the amount of discrimination and bigotry we LGBTQ people have to endure on a daily basis every day of our lives. The ostracizing, the shunning, the ridicule, the name-calling and verbal attacks, the humiliation, the physical attacks, the death threats. I'm 74 years old now, Dr. Burns, and it continues for me and my fellow gay people to this day. After decades of every antidepressant, talk therapy, and even sinister, underhanded conversion therapy, it was Feeling Good, your book, that taught me how to cope and successfully deal with these circumstances. Understanding that many of these attacks come from latent homosexuals and both social and religious erroneous teaching also helps. It's not these facts, it's what I think about them that makes all the difference. Thanks again, David. Sincerely, Dominic.
Well, thank you, Dominic. I loved your email, and also thank you, Kyle Jones, our dear colleague in our Tuesday group, a wonderful human being, fantastic therapist, and we're just so blessed to have you.
And just an all-around wonderful person.
Yes, and we're just so blessed to have our own rainbow group in the Tuesday group. We've got people from every walk of life, from every sexual orientation, and people from all levels of training. We're not just all psychiatrists or all psychologists, and it's just a great joy to hang out and with people in a spirit of love rather than a spirit of hatred.
Yep.
Okay.
So let's do some Ask David questions.
Yep.
Ready?
I'm ready to rock.
Kelly asks, I would love to hear a podcast about how to use or not to use touch in therapy. I personally feel touch is extremely helpful. What is more natural than to hug or put a hand on someone hurting? However, I believe our profession has become so professionalized that it leaves out such a power act of healing. Do you ever use touch when you are practicing, and do you feel it's appropriate?
Well, I have 3 comments, and
I have a comment too.
3 of your own. The first is that you can. Well, I went to I hate going to these ethics and malpractice seminars because they scare the crap out of me. I guess it's okay to use that word. They're frightening, and you see all the loopholes and traps you can get into as a therapist. But at one I attended some years back, the fellow was an attorney, and he just started out by saying that you can shake your patient's hand when you meet them. You can shake your patient's hand at the last session when you terminate therapy. But if you ever touch the patient at any other time, you're potentially in big trouble, because we got the phone ringing. We'll just ignore it, let it ring, because if you ever get an ethics charge or a malpractice suit based on someone feeling that you were inappropriately touching them, your liability company, your malpractice company will not defend you, will not pay any suits. If you got an ethics charge, we will in no way support you. And so
that's pretty harsh.
Yeah, that's just a black and white thing. So that's point number 1. Now on our Sunday hikes, people always hug, say, "Oh, David, good to see you," and then we go off on our hike. But even there, I'm somewhat worried, that someone would find it threatening or awkward or uncomfortable. So that's point number 1. And so I'm very, very careful that way, and don't use touch to enhance the therapeutic relationship or to provide comfort. Now, all that being said, it is important to get an absolute A or A+ on empathy with your patients. And if you use the 5 secrets of effective communication, and you get feedback, like when I'm doing empathy, I ask people 20 minutes into the session, how am I doing? Am I getting an A? Am I getting a B? Am I getting a C? Do you feel that I'm understanding how you feel, and do you feel compassion and being cared about? And you can get an absolute A or A+ on empathy from almost anybody without touching them. You don't need to touch someone to develop a trusting, vibrant, deep, profound, and rapidly healing therapeutic relationship. Now, again, I'm not in a position to tell you or any listener what you should or shouldn't do, because I'm not an ethics board and I'm not an ethics expert. I'm just throwing out some information, and that I personally don't like the idea of getting in trouble with an ethics board. I had a patient who I hadn't seen for 10 years in Philadelphia who went into a psychotic episode and then made a charge that I had planted secret cameras in her room to observe her, and it went to the ethics. I had to talk to the ethics people.
They took that seriously?
Well, they had to investigate it. They were very supportive, and she claimed I was involved in a conspiracy with the local police.
Well, they honored her. That's a good idea.
But then she started stalking me, and I had to have her involuntarily hospitalized as a protection to my family. But things can happen. People can get, profoundly confused, and 90% of the time you get away with a hug, maybe 99% of the time, but it can be misinterpreted. That's just a warning. The third thing I said, and I don't remember if I told this on a podcast or not, but I don't think you need to use touch in healing. And after a workshop, and if I've told this story, then I'm demented, which anyway. So, but it's a great story. I apologize if you've heard it. But after a workshop, this couple came up to me at the end of day one. It was a 2-day workshop. I think it was in Ohio or someplace in the Midwest. And they said, "Oh, do you ever use touch and healing? It's great for phobias." And I said, "Well, no, I don't use touch. I just work verbally, and that's usually enough to cause recovery with people." But they say, "Oh, no, we've got to show you it's the greatest thing." And they said, "Do you have any fears or something? Because we can cure you with this touch." I said, "Well, I used to have the fear of heights, and then I got over it as a teenager, and then it came back because I hadn't done anything at heights, so we could do that one." So they said, "Lie down on this mattress," and then they were poking me and kind of pseudo massage, and they found my fear of heights was some embedded memory in my left shoulder or some such thing, and they worked it all out. And
that's where fear lives, for you and your left shoulder.
Yeah, something like that. And they had all this verbiage and mumbo jumbo things they were saying. It's all very, very impressive sounding. And then we had to get together for dinner later that night. The same couple and the fellow Dave Lima, who organized the workshop, and a few friends. And so then after that, I went up, in the hotel and looked out over the railing. I was just as scared as ever. And then I told him that night at dinner, I said, "I just wanted you to know that it had no impact on my fear of heights." And then they just went ahead talking about how wonderful this touch is, and how it seemed like it didn't even register. So anyway, that's my rant.
Okay, good.
What's your rant?
Well, I have most of my profession, I worked in forensics.
Forensics, yes.
And so it was absolutely forbidden that we never touched clients who were victimized by a crime or who had committed a crime.
Yeah.
And one day I had friends over for dinner, and there was a fellow there who was a social worker, and we were talking about it, and I said, he was a little less experienced than me, and I was telling him, never touch your clients, don't give your clients hugs, and it's kind of the same thing you were saying. And he said, "Well, I run a support group for gay men. If I don't hug them at the end of each session, they feel bad." And I said, "Oh, okay, well, maybe it depends." But
yeah, right.
I 99.9% agree with what you just said.
What do you think about our Sunday hikes?
But those aren't patients or clients. Those are friends.
Yeah, right. Okay, good.
Okay, so this person's email name is Against Machines Taking Over. And he asked, "You say that depression always results from distorted thoughts, but the sadness that results from a failure, rejection, or disappointment is not distorted. It's real. Can you explain a little bit more about this?"
Well, that's a really great question, and it's such a fundamental issue. The way I think about it is that every negative emotion has a healthy version and an unhealthy version. So with depression, the healthy version is sadness. The unhealthy version is depression or a loss of self-esteem or hopelessness. Now, all feelings result from thoughts or perceptions. You have to interpret what's happening in order to have any kind of reaction to it. So sadness results from negative thoughts that are valid and correct. Like I've talked many times about the death of my cat Popcorn, who died in my arms, or my loss of Obi, or it could be the loss of your mother, someone who you loved and really, really cared about. And so you have thoughts of, gosh, I've lost this person or this beloved pet, and he or she meant so much to me, and I loved that person, and it was wonderful to be with that person, and he or she is gone, and these thoughts are not distorted, and those feelings are healthy. And grieving, crying, is an elevated state. It's not a mental illness that has to be treated. It shows that you loved, that you were alive, that you cared, and that you've had a loss. And that's nothing to be afraid of, or to try to control. You just experience it. It's a part of life. But the depression results from distorted thoughts, like I'm a loser because I've had this disappointment in my career, and this shows that I'm no good, and this always happens to me, and I'm worthless, and I'm not as good as I should be. It's things like that, should statements, all or nothing thinking, self-blame, emotional reasoning, mind reading, overgeneralizations. That's what causes unhealthy feelings. So just like depression is healthy, sadness is healthy. Sadness is healthy, depression is unhealthy.
Right.
Fear is healthy. If you're in a frightening situation, it makes sense to be afraid, to protect yourself. An anxiety disorder, fear of flying, public speaking anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, that's unhealthy. Remorse. Most of us, sadly, hurt the people we love, sometimes intentionally because we're annoyed and we snap at them, sometimes unintentionally. But to feel that remorse, that's healthy, and that will move you in a positive direction, and to share that with the person that you hurt.
Right.
But neurotic guilt is irrational. It's not healthy. I had a fellow, and again, I don't remember if I ever said this on a podcast, but he had kind of obsessive compulsive disorder, and I don't know if you might remember if I ever said this, but he was flooded with guilt all day long. I said, well, why do you feel guilty? And he said, well, I gave instructions to a woman at work, said she had to go someplace after work, and she said, what's the best way to get there? And I told her, like, a shortcut, and that's what I'm feeling guilty about. And I said, well, why? And she said, well, because that changed her whole life.
What?
Yeah, because like if she went there, she'll have different thoughts. And if she'd been killed, it would have been my fault. Or if anything bad ever happens to her, it will be my fault, because that changed the trajectory of her whole life. And he was obsessing about this constantly. It was, a classic neurotic guilt. And then what it turned out, he himself was mad at someone that he was shutting out of conscious awareness, and then he would obsess instead. It was like the hidden emotion.
Yeah.
Hidden emotion model. But for every feeling, there's a healthy version and an unhealthy version. So I hope that clarifies against machines taking over, and what a cool name that is.
That is cool.
And he's got another question, too.
He does. He also asked, is there something you used to advocate for before, but then you changed your mind?
Actually, I love that question. There have been quite a few things, and I had a whole list of them, and I've forgotten what they are. But one thing was that when I was in clinical practice, I was indoctrinated with psychopharmacology, but I knew that antidepressants weren't very good. But when I was in clinical practice, if somebody wanted one, I would prescribe it for them, because it just takes 60 seconds. And as long as we don't waste time on it and you do your psychotherapy homework, that's fine. But I published an article in the top psychology journal showing that of the hundreds of patients who came to our clinic, most were treated 60% without antidepressants, and 40% had cognitive therapy plus antidepressants. And those who got the cognitive therapy plus antidepressants actually improved less and more slowly than those who received cognitive therapy alone. And that was when controlling for initial severity.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so I never saw any evidence for their effectiveness, but I would just give them out if a patient asked. Now, if I were in clinical practice, I would not prescribe them at all because the evidence, to my way of thinking, is so strong that they don't really outperform placebos. Another thing where I've changed my mind dramatically, I'll just mention two areas, is I didn't used to think that motivation was important. It was all cognitions. I was kind of under the Beckian spell, and he was powerful and made tremendous contribution of cognitive therapy. But the party line was everything is cognition. And now I've seen that's not true at all. People are affected tremendously by believing what we want to believe. We think and feel what we want to feel, and resistance does in fact play a tremendous role in recovery or the lack of recovery as well as the speed of recovery. And that's why I've created Team CBT, is to include a powerful motivational dimension, a dimension I thought that was not important early in my career, and it has transformed my clinical work, and I hope it will transform the field as well. But there's a lot of things that change all the time in Team, and one of the things I love in Team is working with brilliant people like you and Jill Levitt and Danielle Levy and Helen Yenny-Komchian and Jacob Towery and Heather Clegg and so many fantastic people, and the model evolves constantly. We're coming up with new teaching techniques. I change the way I teach all the time. I see a beautiful example from you or from Jill Levitt, and we're always evolving the theory. We're always developing new treatment and training techniques. And what I love about it is that nothing is fixed. But when I was a resident, everything was fixed. You had to learn this proper way, and you did that same approach of therapy all the time. They weren't as flexible and open, and so I think we need to be changing our minds all the time, because I find out all the time when I used to sit at the computer doing statistical analysis, which is one of my favorite things, I could test theories as many as 60 an hour if I had a big database. And one thing that the computer trained me, I was using this powerful structural equation modeling program called AMOS. And the neat thing about it is you put your data in and then you draw a picture of your theory, what you think is going on, like the relationship between empathy and changes in depression or whatever you think is in your model. I used to create mathematical models of psychotherapy. And 99% of the time, the computer would tell me your theory sucks. It can't possibly be true because it can't be fitted to the data that you've given. And I used to love that. The computer was so good at shooting things down, and it would force you to look at things on a deeper level and find out why your thinking is wrong and then evolve it. And I think this capacity to be wrong is the key to the forward movement in our field. It's the basis of science, really. And then the capacity to fail is the key to successful therapy.
And to growth.
And to grow, yeah. When you fail, you learn. When you fail with a patient, talk it over, you can make a breakthrough. So there was another awesome question.
Great. Eduardo asks, how do you treat hypochondriasis?
Hypochondriasis.
I can't say that word. How do you treat hypochondriasis? Almost all articles and advice I've read for hypochondriasis try to cover the writer's back by first and foremost telling you that you should get yourself checked for the real causes for your concern. So How do you treat hypochondriasis?
Well, this is one of my favorite things, and which I mentioned on a podcast. I was really a terrible medical student. I shouldn't have gone to medical school because I wasn't a pre-med, and I thought that dissecting cadavers was horribly difficult, and I didn't have all those pre-med courses in college. But the one thing I really liked was working with Dr. Alan Barber at Stanford, who was head of the outpatient medicine. And they sent him from all over the western United States and Alaska, the most difficult patients who had medical problems that no one could figure out. And these were people going to doctor for chest pain or belly pain or headaches or dizziness or chronic fatigue, getting often hundreds of thousands of dollars of lab work.
Wow.
And everything was always normal. And they finally say, well, you better go to Stanford. And there's this fellow there, Alan Barber, who might be able to help you. And so as a medical student, we'd work up the patient. They'd come to the clinic, and we'd look through the chart and do a history and physical, and then present it in the hall to Dr. Barber. And his idea was that in almost all of these cases, what was really going on is there's something that was bothering the patient that he or she isn't telling you, and maybe isn't even admitting to themselves. And if you can bring that to conscious awareness and suggest to the patient to work on the human problem. See, they didn't have medical problems, they had human problems, but they kept going to doctors was the problem. And an example of it was this woman who came in, well, I'll disguise it a little. Let's say she flew in, let's say from Nova Scotia on a private airplane to Stanford. Did you know this story?
I think I know the story, yeah. But it's a really great story. So
and then was met by an ambulance at the airport and with full sirens on, driven to Stanford. And then they rushed her in to the outpatient clinic, and she's screaming on the gurney that she needs emergency surgery. And I was thinking, why is she coming to the outpatient clinic if she needs emergency surgery? Why don't they take her onto the back of the hospital where the emergency room is?
Right.
But she had this thick chart, and so I took her in to examine her, and she was saying, "Please, I've got to have a emergency surgery on my belly. I've got excruciating belly pain." And so I looked through her chart. She'd had 7 laparotomies, emergency laparotomies on her abdomen.
And what's a laparotomy?
Yeah, well, they would cut her abdomen open and look in there for something. And then I would read they take tissue and do pathology and stuff, and I was reading the reports, and everything was always normal except the first time that she had the surgery, they found a bullet in her abdomen. And so I was trying to figure this out, and so I wasn't good on medical exams or anything, but I took the stethoscope and I was touching her stomach, which seemed soft. Usually if you have a rupture or hemorrhage in your abdomen, peritonitis, it's rigid like a board. Oh. And it was just soft and normal. And then I listened with my stethoscope, and her bowel sounds seemed normal. And her husband was right there. And I said, well, I tried to take a history. Does anything make the pain better or worse? And she said, yes. And I said, what makes it worse? And she said, being with my husband. And I said, does anything make it better? And she says, when I'm not around my husband. And so I said to him, would you mind just to step out for a moment while I complete the exam? And so he stepped out of the room, and then she said, oh, I'm feeling better. And what it turned out is her husband had shot her years earlier in a fight that they had.
Oh my God.
And then he owned some kind of a factory, manufacturing, and he had her working on the production line 12 hours a day.
Oh my God.
And she was just very unhappy, and that was her body's way of saying, this marriage is killing me. It was a symbolic expression of what was a psychological problem, and so I presented to Dr.
Well,
Barber.
He did try to kill her if he shot her in the stomach. So, but then it continued to try to kill her by putting her on the assembly line for 12 hours.
Wow. And so we referred them for marital therapy, not, emergency surgery. And so this is just one
or a divorce attorney
technique, but it's often the one that is effective when you're working with people with hypochondriasis, which means aches and pains that have no medical cause. Now, all that being said, even Alan Barber said he was only able to cure 50% of the people who came to his clinic, because he said 50% of them were not interested in a psychological explanation. They were yearning to have an illness. And sometimes that can be financially motivated, like to get.
But do you think sometimes they like attention? Do you think sometimes people like the attention of medical doctors?
It's somewhat mysterious to me, but that's another explanation. They want that relationship, and some people will even, as you know, intentionally fake illnesses to get a lot of medical attention, called Munchausen syndrome. And some people will create wounds and injuries in children to keep bringing the children so that they and the child can keep getting this medical attention. But the main thing, it's subconscious. The person isn't consciously aware that there's a problem in their life that they're not dealing with. So that's just one approach. That's called the hidden emotion model. But it's an important one because doctors don't know about it, and doctors get sucked into, as he say, giving more and more medical tests to protect themselves from a liability point of view, and they never ask the patient the question: is there something of a human nature that's bothering you? Maybe the children went away to college, and you're feeling lonely, and you need to work on finding some things to do with your life, get work, or it could be anything. It could be anger, it could be any kind of problem the person isn't dealing with.
Wow, that was really interesting. Okay, Eduardo also asked, I've been struggling with anxiety, and after reading When Panic Attacks, I got very interested in giving the hidden emotion model or method a try. But it seems to be structureless. It seems to require a lot of detective work with no clear sheet or procedure. It's just detective work and then do something about it. Is there some newer technique to dig into what's eating you?
No, I've never found a newer technique, but when I'm treating people with anxiety, I simply say to them, I'll treat your anxiety, your panic attacks, your phobias, your post-traumatic stress disorder, your generalized anxiety, whatever it is. But there's a high likelihood, at least 50%, maybe 75%, that there's something you're not telling me that's bothering you. And if we can figure out what it is, and you can express that feeling or deal with that problem, there's a good chance your anxiety will disappear, probably completely. And then the detective work, I just say that to a patient twice a session. And then I'll also guess what the thing might be that's bothering them. And there's a few hints that make the detective work slightly easier. One is that the thing that the person is suppressing, that they're pushing out of conscious awareness, the problem, it's a problem in the here and now. It's never buried in the past. It's never some trauma from childhood or from the past. Some people do have childhood traumas, and that can easily be cured in almost all cases quickly. But this is not that kind of issue. This is something that's bothering them today.
It's not a recovered memory.
No. The problem is that people who develop anxiety are overly nice in most cases, and they're trying to suppress some feeling that they think that they're not supposed to have. And so if you look at the anxiety is also a symbolic expression of the thing that's bothering them. Now again, I'm trying to remember, and I don't want to repeat myself too much. I talk about the hike up in Calgary and the woman with panic attacks.
Oh yes, I think you have.
And we talked about that on a podcast.
Yeah.
That was a perfect example. It was just a woman who was angry with her kids but she didn't admit it because she's trying to be a perfect mother. But she's feeling overwhelmed and ticked off, and then has a panic attack and thinks she's dying. And then the symbolic thing is that in her fantasy, you see she's abandoning her children. But because she's dying, she feels like the victim, so she doesn't notice the aggressive element she feels that in her husband, everyone's putting too many demands on her.
Right.
She's feeling angry and overwhelmed. And once it finally dawned on her, her panic disappeared in a flash. So that's the hidden emotion model. And I don't think there's any clever way to bring it out, except just to tell the person, I suspect this is going on, and then say, could it be this? Could it be that? And usually the patient will say, no, that's not right. And then when they come up with it's pretty huge.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we need to stop here. We've got a bunch more tremendous questions, but we can do include them in another Ask David, because I think we're about a good more than 30 minutes here.
Okay, well, thank you for listening, everyone, and thank you, David, for this enlightening Ask David episode.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you again next week. And have a good one. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this episode under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. The theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.